Sanctuary here. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, and for those of us that are joining me online as I take the next couple of hours and share some photos, experiences, and memorable moments from my trip. At the start of this, I want to say that this trip was packed to the brim with experiences. I have a couple hours tonight, and I won't get through them all, but I picked out some of the more memorable ones, at least for myself, and I hope you'll feel the same way. I would think things like, wow, I've read about some of these events that took place, both in world history and biblical history, and I would say things like, it's one thing to read about them, and have pictures in your head of what that would have looked like. It's a whole other thing to be able to experience these places in person. I've heard a few people say, well, now we get to take this trip vicariously through you. And I'm like, that's great. We can do that. But I do, if you ever have an opportunity, take the trip. It'll be worth it. I hope one day that I can go back and take some more time to experience each of these places. And I'm very thankful for the support that I had on this trip. I hope it's okay that I'm sitting up here. I didn't feel like I should stand for 2 hours. It's been a very long day. So I'm going to sit up here so you can all see behind me. My hope for tonight is that these photos will do some justice to what I experienced. And so, without any further ado, why don't we begin, shall we? So we started off with the travel day, and I know this isn't one of those things where you're like, well, this isn't really a part of your trip, isn't it? I say, well, it was. I'm not counting it as day one, but the day started at 1:30 a.m. on Monday morning. I don't know of any of you that have been up at 1:30 a.m., but there's not very many people up at that time. I was up at 1:30. My flight took off at 5 o'clock. Here's a photo of me taking off at 5. Everybody, or at least half of Omaha, is still asleep. And, I like to take photos, so we're starting right here and there. You probably couldn't see that one all that well, and then it got a little brighter as time went on. We took off from Dallas-Fort Worth, and from there made our way to JFK Airport. So all of these places I had never been before, and here I am sharing them with you. Now, given we were in the airport, there wasn't a whole lot of sightseeing that I could do while I was in New York. It would have been great to go, take a taxi or an Uber somewhere else. My son and daughter both wanted me to go to the Statue of Liberty, and I said, well, maybe next time. I didn't really feel comfortable leaving the airport, so I didn't. Here I was just waiting around for my international flight. From the time we landed in New York to we landed about 1:30, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, until we were to take off to Poland, which was at 1 o'clock the next morning. So if you imagine, 1:30 that morning, taking off at 1 o'clock the next morning, made for quite the long day. Now, I did share this with you already. I had an 8-hour flight there. I guess flying is not my thing, any longer than 2 to 3 hours at a time, especially flying that long in a big jet. I did not sleep very well that night, but that's the worst part of my trip, okay? So there was a lot of excitement that came there with that. So here we are at day one. We landed. It was the middle of the afternoon in Warsaw, Poland, and our official day one of the trip began. And even though the day before really felt like it melded together with that day, given there was only a couple of hours of sleep on that flight, it made for a very long, yet good, first day of the trip. Traveling to our first destination, the first things that would catch my eye were the road signs. Road signs were all in Polish, which was cool to see. We were sort of getting ourselves into the culture there, so to speak. We would also see different buildings like this and others. We drove by this particular building, and I shared with my family earlier this afternoon that I had a funny story about a building, maybe not so funny. I thought it was funny, but at the same time, it's a little bit inconsiderate. This was a gift, this building here with the clock at the top, was a gift from Joseph Stalin in the year 1945. And what's interesting is that Stalin actually offered 2 gifts. either this building or financial aid for the city's reconstruction after the devastation of World War II. Poland chose the financial aid. And Stalin said, here's your building. And then we made our first stop, official stop of the trip, the Nozick Synagogue. And this Nozick Synagogue, entering in, one could see some very immaculate, building architecture throughout. It was a very neat place to be. It had all been redone for reasons that I'll share here shortly. These synagogues were what we know as places where people would gather to read the Torah and such. But it was also seen as a sort of gathering or a community center where families and Jewish communities would come together and share meals and share experiences or various things, events, and so on and so forth. Behind the veil, which I did take a closer look at, or curtain, there would be the Torah, which would be stored here and where they would take their daily readings from. An interesting thing to note about this synagogue, which is what I wanted to share, is that it was the only surviving pre-war house of prayer in Warsaw. With the invasion of the Nazi army from Germany, all of the other synagogues in Warsaw would be destroyed except for this one. As history would tell, they would see this one to be fit to be used for a place to keep their horses. So it would be defaced and used for something obviously terrible, but it would later be reconstructed, refurbished, and brought back to its original intent. And you also see in that picture, this is the group of people that was on this trip with me. So we had a group of about 35 people, I think, 30, 35, somewhere in there. And looking around the area that we were in, I was blown away by some of the wonderful architecture throughout the town. And I could not take enough time to snap all of the photos that I wanted to of all of them. I told Brother Josh that I took about 1,000 photos, and tonight I'm sharing with you merely maybe 20% of those. We can perhaps find a time to get together to share more of those, but I found some of these to be some of the most memorable. And with all the architecture in the area, I could have done a completely different presentation on just that. Here's another beautiful building that we would drive by as we were on our bus. And then we would make our way to a memorial about the ghetto wall, which was built in Warsaw in 1943. These ghettos, as you may or may not know, were used to imprison Jews. The Jews were forced to go there. They weren't allowed to leave these areas under virtually any circumstance. If they tried, they could or would be killed. I think I remember hearing that they might have been able to leave for work or something, but even that could be speculation. There was very little reasons, if any, that they could leave. We then made our way to the Omaha Cemetery, one of the largest cemeteries in Europe and in the world. Now, some may ask, as I did, why would we go to a cemetery? But we would hear different stories of people, and I thought, although these people had died, their stories would live on. And these are some of the stories that we heard. It would not be a focus so much on their death, but rather remembering their lives. Now, I tried to get a picture of just how large this cemetery was. The cemetery covered 83 acres of land containing over 200,000 graves. And some marked and others not. There was another thing which I'll share here shortly. Each gravestone would tell a story of some kind we would look at, and our tour guide would ask us what we thought their life story was. We would walk up to a certain gravestone, and he would ask, so what do you think they did for a living? Because it would tell their life story. You can also see marks on the sides of some of the gravestones. This cemetery would be one that the Nazis would invade an attempt to destroy. There were many stones knocked over. There were many stones that were taken from here and used for other things. Some stones were so riddled with what looked to be bullet marks. And you can see also some stones that were knocked over. We learned that many of the gravestones were taken, as I'd shared, and I'll tell you where they take some of them in just a bit. Seeing the destruction, which served to be a sober reminder of just what took place here during World War II and the Holocaust. And this was the mere beginning of it. This particular stone, what does that look like to you? A tree stump, right? This would signify the life of a young person. You can see that the tree was cut off or cut too short, which would tell someone that they did not get to live out their whole lives. They died at a very young age. And there were a few that were like this in there, all signifying that very same thing. Here we'll see a couple more examples of ones that we stopped at. The one that you see on my right, is that of a person who was in an acting career. They did acting as a way of living. And then the one on the other side, which we were asked about, would be one that would work as a prompter, or what they referred to as a whisperer, being the person who would whisper lines to actors on stage if they were forgetful. And these two were right beside each other. In looking here, one might not think too much about it, but what lies beneath this tarp and pile of wood is the story of a heroic young man who would dig a tunnel out from within the ghetto. He would use this tunnel to show others a way of escape and allow others to escape from the ghetto, until one evening, late evening it was, he was doing that very same thing, and he heard some dogs barking in the distance. It would be the Nazi soldiers who would come to invade the place, and he would go hide behind a tree, and the people that he was with would all eventually be shot and killed there. He would live to tell that story, as well as a host of others, until he died some years later. Then we moved on to this memorial, along with one close beside it, commemorating the mass grave of the Warsaw Ghetto victims. This is another part of that memorial. This pile of stones here was the mass grave. You'll also see a structure at the top to the right of this that's got what looks to be columns, which would also be filled with these stones, signifying another portion of that mass grave. Then we made our way to the ghetto wall on Zlata Street, where we would see fragments of a pre-war building. I didn't take a photo of it, but we would look up the sides of these buildings where we were told of the terrible housing in the ghetto, the terrible way of living, if you will. It was unclean. There was diseases and things like that because of this way of living. The rule was given that there had to be 8 people per window, 8 people living in whatever quarter per window. So if you think of how many windows are on your house and you multiply that by 8, that's how many people would be forced to live in that type of area. And this is why there were sicknesses that were happening. They were getting sick and they were dying, or they were deathly ill. Imagine that and these terrible living conditions within. Later that evening, as the evening went on, we would wind down from our long trip there, and we would all be looking forward to going to sleep that evening. But before we did that, we would head out for a late dinner. We would walk past the presidential palace in Warsaw and see a statue like the one behind me. We would also see another area, this area here, which was another part of that presidential palace. I know these pictures are a little dark, so hopefully you can see them as well as I can see them here. And there were also some other neat designs throughout the area, some things that caught my eye and I thought I would share. Then we would continue our walk down the royal route, where we would spend the majority of the rest of our evening. But before the evening was over, something that really was memorable to me, and when we were heading back to the hotel, we came across this: the tomb of the unknown soldier in Warsaw. We got the opportunity at that moment to see the guard change, or the changing of guards. It changes every hour for 365 days a year. And what an experience that was. I took about a 3-minute video of it all, and I often find myself going back and watching that just to experience that again. So, that was the end of day one. Again, we were thankful to get some sleep that night after the long 48-hour day before that. And now we were continuing on with day two. And now I told you there would be a few photos of food. And this just so happens to be one of a partially piece of eaten food. So forgive me if that grosses you out. But I couldn't pass up the opportunity to share this with you, okay? I picked this up from the breakfast buffet, and there were a lot of different sausages there. We are in Poland, and they are known for their variety of different kielbasa, or sausages. And so I saw this one, and I didn't know what it was, but I took it, and I put it on my plate, and I cut it open, and I said, okay, this looks interesting. And I took a bite of it. I still didn't know what it was, but I wasn't a huge fan of the taste of it. And it turned out to be blood sausage. Now, yes, I saw a whole bunch of noses go, nope, not for me, and it definitely was not for me, because that was the only bite I took of that. Some may like it, but again, it just wasn't for me. So, at that point, we made our way to our first stop, the Majdanek Death Camp. It is a Nazi concentration and extermination camp located on the outskirts of the city of Lublin during World War II. And this memorial here, this piece here was actually a memorial that was built after the liberation of that camp, and it was built after World War II. Now, you can barely see it in the distance on this photo, but here we are walking up to that camp. The camp was very large in size. It was a very long walk throughout that camp, many experiences and such. And I tried to just get a wide angle view of that. Getting closer, we would see buildings like this on the outside of the fences where the guards, the soldiers, commanders, and others would be housed. I did look at a map of what it would have looked like when it was built at the time, and there were places where the dogs would stay and different things like that, which we did not see because it was torn down, or it was after World War II. Many of the buildings were burnt down. Which again, what I will share with you now is most of the wood buildings that you see have been remade so that we can see them now, because many of them again were burnt down after World War II, or right before the end of it, to just get rid of any evidence of anything that happened. This would be one of the many guard towers in the camp. And just to give a view of how large this camp was, you can see those guard towers going on for seemingly ever until the end of that tree line there. Our first stop would be the gas chamber, which would be used in the horrific, dehumanizing killings of many, many Jews. Now, just remember what kind of deception that would take place at this time, that would lead them to this point. It didn't start here. It started in the ghettos. It started even before that time. They were led here, if you will, because they had lice and different things like that. They had these sicknesses, and so they would be told, "Hey, come to this sanitization shower. This is, we need to shave your heads too." All for the sake of what was about to happen. Where the dehumanizing began. This is another photo of that sanitization shower area where many of them would stand at one time. Some 100, 250 people would stand at one time. And at this point, you just wonder what's going on in their heads. You're not there. You can't experience it, but you just wonder. And then they would make their way, forcefully, sometimes not, to the gas chamber. It seemed so surreal. Again, it's one of those things you read about in history and things like that, but being there in the heart of it all, and what happened during this time was very real. And being here again was very eye-opening in that fact. We would see these cans stacked up outside of the gas chambers, which would be used, this is what would store the chemical known as Cyclone B. Cyclone B, which would be used in some of the gas chambers. Others would use other types of gases. And I'll show another photo in a bit, but they were full of these little blue pill-looking things. To activate the Cyclone B, one would just have to open the container. The guards that would be the ones to pour these into those areas from the roof would have to wear masks because they were so lethal. And opening the cans to them, they were activated by air. And so immediately the gases would begin, and they would drop it through the hole in the ceiling, and it would release this deadly gas, killing people within 20 to 30 minutes, if not sooner. Sickening. The guards would sit here in a room next door and watch as people would die. And to look inside of the grim walls of the gas chamber, you can imagine the sounds that would come from this chamber. People screaming, children crying, some shouting prayers, and others singing the Jewish anthem, all slowly fading as they would succumb to the lethal gases. Those who were selected to live in the camp, and I use the term live in quotations because living was no better by any means. But those that were selected to live would be forced into labor that would be extremely difficult. And they would not be fed well either. I came across some pictures while I was there, which I won't share tonight, just what the body would go through during that time of dehumanizing, during the time of working, and how they were mistreated and different things like that. We saw this beautiful family in one picture, and there was a woman in the picture, and she was kind of the focal point of that picture, but then we would see a picture of her just 2 years later. No muscles, hunched over, no tone or anything, and just a completely different person. And getting back to this photo here in particular, some were forced to push around these cylinders of stone, making the road smooth. Now, you remember when I said about the gravestones that were taken from the graveyard, from the cemeteries? Some of those were brought to places like these camps, and they were crushed up, and they were made into the roads, and these prisoners were forced to roll these over to try to smooth those roads out. Many of them, if not all of them, probably not having shoes to wear or anything like that either. So these grave conditions that they would have been in. And this is a photo that really affected me right away. We would, you see in the photo here, there's piles and piles and piles of shoes. The shoes of the victims just here at Madonic, or there at Madonic. And a quote would ring through my mind for probably the rest of that day. And it said, all over the world, you see people without shoes. Only in Medonic do you see shoes without people. We would see fences like such, with the fences that would be on the outside of these places that they kept the prisoners. People would attempt to run into the electric fence because they wanted to end their own lives by touching it. They didn't want to be there. They said, I've had enough. The soldiers and guards wouldn't let them, though. They would see them running. We'd hear accounts of these guards who would shoot them while they were running, walk up to them and shoot them in their kneecaps and say, you don't choose how you die, we do. This was a sleeping quarter, and I have a better one coming of the inside of one from another camp. But each of these sleeping quarters would house 400 to 500 prisoners in each one. These were ruins of some of the other camp areas. Again, like I said at the beginning, many were made of wood and were destroyed toward the end of the war to remove any evidence. So what you would see as wooden would often be rebuilt, but they left some like this. In the midst of them, there were a few different aspects which I'll try to walk through. And then we'd make our way up to the top of the hill at the camp, and we would enter into the crematorium. Now, this was not built until almost a year or so after the camp began. Per historical documents, this was the second crematorium. There was another one that they could not find. It was built because they could not get rid of the bodies fast enough. They would bury the bodies, and that just wasn't efficient enough for them. A grim thought. So they thought they had to build a crematory to quicken things along, to be more efficient. And that was the reason why they started using Cyclone B as well. We would see areas like this. You'd walk into the crematorium, and you'd hear stories of them laying dead bodies on this very table, cutting them open, removing any valuables that the prisoners would have ingested before they were sent into the chambers, because they didn't want them to be taken away from them. And they would also, you would read of them removing any gold teeth from their bodies as well. Just sickening. And I know the trip gets brighter, but this is a very heavy moment of that trip, these next 2 days. With the crematorium, or within there, I guess, again, there would be a room that we would turn to see that had a bathtub in it. It would be that which the leader of the camp, the commander of the camp, would use. And the water would be heated by the ovens in the crematorium. And this is just a glimpse of those said ovens. A heavy day it was. We ended our tour for that day visiting this memorial, which is a mass grave where the bodies of Jews would be dumped. Sometimes we'd heard a story of some 800 people who were brought here alive, and there would be this mass extermination of them. They would kill them all right there, and they would all fall to their graves in that very moment. Children too, children included in that. So to wind down after the heavy day, a few people from our group headed out on the town to a well-known food stand that there had been some hype building up. This is a brighter part of the trip. So we would make our way to this food stand here. And this man here who was cooking the sausages made his own Polish sausages. He would be here cooking them over an open fire each night. And that bread you see, that was pretty good too. Yeah. Once you eat one, you can never eat another one like it. I only had one per evening. There was a baked potato stand across the street, and I really wanted to try a baked potato, but don't judge me on this, or do. It's up to you. But we had already had our meals for that night, so this was after the meals. We'd let our food digest a little bit and say, hey, let's go hit up that Polish sausage stand again. I say, hey, I want to try a baked potato, but both nights it was just too much to pass up. So, moving on to day 3 now. On this day 3 would be another heavy day. We would visit both sites of Auschwitz, Auschwitz I and Auschwitz II, which is known as Auschwitz-Birkenau. This is the sign above the entrance to the camp of Auschwitz I. You'll see some words there. Now, the sign was built by prisoners in the work camp, and the words would read in English, "Work makes free." So they would see this as they were entering into the camp. Now, it's not very noticeable, at least from this photo, but if you see on the screen here, you see this bee over here on Arbiet? That bee was intentionally designed or flipped upside down. And the people that built that did that as a deliberate act of defiance, forever engraved in such a way. And here's a view of just part of the camp. As we were walking in, there were many different places to look at that time, and you would see all these brick buildings that would be used for various things during the time. Here's a booth where, as the sign states, the SS man would be the one responsible for conducting roll call and collecting reports on the number of prisoners. This is where that said person would go to take shelter during inclement weather. And then we would enter into one of the buildings. Again, like I said, some of the buildings now would be transformed into areas that would show different facets of history of the camp. Here we can see a replica of what the gas chamber / crematorium would have looked like. You'll see, where they would enter in, and it was a replica of that. And here's another view of that, or another portion of that replica anyway. And in front of that, we would see a pile of what Cyclone B would have looked like, just a pile of pills there, essentially. Remembering that it was stored in those cans that we saw at Madonic just a day before. And then we would get to the shoes. Another massive pile of shoes. And you think about this, and all the people that would have had to remove those shoes. I mean, this filled an entire room. You saw the building from the outside and how long that was. Well, this whole pile of shoes was as long as that building, and it was 6 to 8, maybe even 10 feet high in that area. It was blocked off by some glass, thankfully, but you would see these piles of shoes just go on forever. And not just that, but children's shoes. As a father, I couldn't keep it together at that point, rightfully so. You imagine the people, but then you imagine the children. You think about what happened during that time, and the lack of a better word, the selection process for those that lived and those that died when they entered the camps. And I'll get to that in just a little bit, but they were selected by a mere flick of a thumb. They were separated with the women and the children and the boys under 12 on one side, and the men and the boys over 12 on the other side. And even at that, they were selected if they had, if they were in wheelchairs, or if they had crutches, or if they had knee braces, which I'll show here. Many of them came there with knee braces and crutches and body braces and things like that. All of them would be taken away and brought, to this camp, if you will, taken away from the Jews, rather, and brought to this camp. And they would, because they would be deemed useless by the Nazis, be sent to their death. There was another place that I didn't get a picture of either, but you would see piles of glasses. They would have to remove their glasses. They couldn't keep them. And then here in this photo, this picture speaks a lot. And it's, if you look closely, the Jews would be told to bring their cooking utensils with them, where they were packed. When they were packed into these vehicles or these cattle cars to be brought to the camps. Again, deception happening. Hey, take these things with you because you're going to need them. You're going to be able to use them. And you'll see here the different colors of pans. Well, in Jewish tradition or Jewish custom, they would have different pans that they would use for cooking milk products, and different pans that they would use for cooking meat products, and something in between there as well. We would visit a house in Jerusalem a few days from now where they would have two different sinks, and you couldn't put meats in one, and you couldn't put milk products in the other. We'll get to that in just a bit. And then you would see suitcases. Again, continuing with the deception. They would pack their clothes and their belongings. They would put their names and their addresses and other information. They would write them on them so they could find them after they returned from these showers that they were taking. Here's a close-up view of one of them, Hannah Reiner. I'm assuming that's either her birthday or an address of some kind, and then another number, which I wasn't sure what that was. It might have been the number that she was assigned when she got to the camp. And then we came across the Book of Names, as it's called. There are 4.7 million names listed in this book, which is not all. That was not the total amount that were killed during the Holocaust, but 4.7 million of those names were listed in this book, and this book went virtually the whole length of a building as well. And this was just a view of the inside of that book, just one page. When we exited the camp, we would look to our right and see this house here, who was owned, if you will, by the commander of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss, and his entire family. This is literally right next door to the buildings that would house the Jews. And 500 yards from the gas chamber, we were standing next to the gas chamber, we would look and see this house right here. I'd hear stories. The tour guide would share stories about how this man would invite family members and friends over to spend the holidays and summers with them. They would have these celebrations. He would show them certain aspects of the camp, and not long after the war, rightfully so, he would be sentenced to death by hanging, and they would hang him right there in front of the gas chamber. We then made our way into the gas chamber here at Auschwitz, which was also a crematorium, which was, again, just mere yards away from his house. Entering in, you would see where they would drop the Zyklon B or other gases from into the chamber, and the ovens in the crematorium. Then we made our way to Birkenau. Birkenau was Auschwitz II, known as Birkenau. Entering in, we would tour these buildings, and one of the first ones that we would tour was the lavatory, or the bathroom. This would be considered a safe place for the Jews, as the stink would keep the guards away. They wouldn't want to get anywhere near that place. At one time, this didn't have a roof on it until the guards complained enough and said, "This really stinks, build a roof on it." So it became an even more safe place for these prisoners to go. It would also be sought after and seen as the best job for a prisoner to have. cleaning the place. Because again, the guards would not come near them. They were given somewhat free reign in here. If they were in here, they would spend all day in here so they wouldn't have to be, bossed around by them. A view of the living quarters inside. At one point, they could not build these living quarters fast enough out of brick, which I'll show soon. So what they would do is they would put an ad in the paper and say, "Who can build horse stalls? We need quotes for horse stalls." And the cheapest bid won, the cheapest and the fastest one won. Each of these horse stalls were meant to hold 20, 25 horses, would now house 400 to 500 prisoners. And you can see the three levels of the sleeping quarters there. And, this is a very sickening thing too. But there would be one bucket in each of these quarters that would be used for people to use the restroom if they need to use it. And once that bucket was full, they didn't see any need to get up anymore because they didn't have any energy the way it is. So they would do it where they lie. And I suppose, with that being said, a sought-after place at that point would be a top level in this sleeping area because, as you can imagine, being on the lower level would not be a great place to be. Here is a cattle car that was brought here as a memorial that would bring these Jews in, bringing them in by the thousands. Birkenau was considered to be one of the largest extermination camps during the Holocaust. History tells us that 1.1 million Jews were murdered here. It was quite terrible how it flowed as well. Of all the Jews that were brought, remember how they were selected by the mere flick of a thumb? 85% of them would be murdered within 30 minutes of arriving. Here are the brick buildings that I mentioned. So they couldn't build these fast enough, and then they would separate the women and the men, and they also got support from the Red Cross, okay? And how they got support from the Red Cross is they would build these family units. So they would have the men's unit, they would have the women's unit, and then they would have these family units, and they would tell these prisoners they were in the family units, "Hey, you need to act this way or you're going to die." Or you need to act this way or something really bad is going to happen to you. So they would be forced to pretend to be this happy family, if you will. So the Red Cross would continue to support them in this work camp. Here's the sleeping quarters inside of the brick buildings. Here's a part of the railway that was inside of Birkenau. You saw the picture that I took outside. This was as we were inside. And at some point, more railway had to be added because they didn't think it was long enough. They couldn't fit enough rail cars in there. They couldn't fit enough of these cattle cars in there. So they had to add more so they could bring more people in at one time. And this is where we ended our journey through the camps that day. Heaviness was definitely setting in at that time. It's something that will stick with me for a lifetime. At that point, we would take a longer trip, if you will, to Krakow, and we would go to the Jewish quarter of Krakow, where many people would be removed and then relocated to a ghetto. Another picture of that area there. We would end our evening of this day out on the town, again, visiting shops and such. And I've got a couple other photos here that will show more of the scenery from that evening. I should say we were in Krakow already, so we didn't have to travel anywhere that day. We were already there. Anyways, but this was another picture from that evening and we would see buildings like this, just be taken away by that. And then on day 4, we would say goodbye to Poland and make our way to Israel. Airport here in Poland, just to show you, here we are, proof that, hey, I'm going to Tel Aviv. Here's where the trips start to get a little, I want to say, less heavy. There were some definite moments that I'll share with you in just a moment, but I'm so thankful and appreciative that I was able to be there in Poland and see the things that I saw, and it really helped me to get a different perspective of what just happened during that time. Flying now to Israel, I would learn that the jet that we were on had a missile defense system on it. I wouldn't learn that until we landed, thankfully. Yeah. I got off the jet, and they're like, hey, do you know there's a missile defense system on that jet? I'm like, huh, never thought of it, but cool, Anyways, so just a fun fact about that. Some of the things that we would experience here would kind of trail more into that. So now that we had arrived in Tel Aviv, we made our way to our bus, and we would arrive to see the start of a beautiful sunset, seeing the sun reflect off the buildings. Here we are in Jerusalem. We then made our way to the Western Wall. This was the evening leading up to Shabbat. Shabbat would begin at sundown, and we were allowed to take photos up until that time. We were told that once Shabbat began, no photos can be taken at the Western Wall. The place would start to get very packed. As Shabbat was about to begin, later that evening, we would get the opportunity, and a once-in-a-lifetime thing, really. Maybe it'll happen again, but I doubt it. We got to enjoy a Shabbat dinner with a woman, and not just any woman, but one who was a Holocaust survivor. We weren't allowed to take photos or anything, but we went through the ins and outs of a Shabbat dinner experience, as it was called. They would hand out these little booklets kind of explaining what Shabbat was. We would share stories. We would sing these songs that they would sing. We would eat a lot of the food that they would prepare. And once Shabbat began, you can't cook anything either, so it was all prepared ahead of time. And just a great experience altogether. We were at this woman's house for probably 4 or 5 hours, I think. Something along. It was a long time, but it was a very good experience. And the picture here doesn't really do it justice, but after that evening, I looked outside to see this wonderful view from my hotel room in Jerusalem. It just, everything kind of set in. Here we are. So now moving on to day 5, continuing in Jerusalem. As I had promised, the next day first brought a fabulous spread of different breakfast items. Some typical, while others were not. Remember that it was Shabbat, so there was a lot of things that were not cooked or anything like that. There were a lot of things that weren't your typical breakfast item. There was one day where myself and a few other people must have eaten something that was not prepared properly. And so my tour guide was frantically walking around like, did you eat the cottage cheese? Did you eat the cottage cheese? And he would ask us all these questions, and I'm like, I might have eaten the cottage cheese. I don't remember what I ate this morning. This day's been so full of experiences, but that was just a little facet of that. So another picture of the spread, the breakfast spread, and finally another picture. Just the place was full of food, okay? There was a lot of good food there. Then we made our way to the top of the Mount of Olives, and we were able to enjoy this foggy morning overlooking the Jerusalem skyline. Another view of a little more close up. And then we made our way to the Garden of Gethsemane. The Garden of Gethsemane. And although one does not know the exact location here or whatnot, Jesus would be here awaiting, praying as he would experience his betrayal and arrest, waiting for the impending crucifixion. The place was full. There were a lot of trees here. You know, you saw that picture, and many of the trees would be these ancient olive trees. And just walking through the area, just you put yourself in that moment of that moment that Jesus was there praying and you know, thinking of what was to come and knowing. We would then walk down part of what was referred to as Palm Sunday Road, which would have been the roads that Jesus followed as he entered into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. As we continued, we ventured to St. Anne's Church, which was where we would find the Pool of Bethesda. And as you can see, there was some depth to this area. There were many deep places here, and while some of it was run over with more modern work, there were some areas that were redone from the Romans. Much of the area remained as it would have been during those times that we read of in Scripture. We would get to walk around and through the Pool of Bethesda, which was quite captivating. It was great to be there and think of, you know, what had happened there. This here is an aqueduct, and there's some discussion or debate as to whether or not the pool was supplied by an aqueduct or by a natural spring. This could have been added later on, but it was neat to be able to enter into it. You see those stairs going down. I was able to go down and snap some photos within there. You know, when we were there, one of the people that we were with pointed out that a pigeon was stuck down there. There was some water down there, and pigeons don't know how to swim very well. So you can put two and two together there. But anyways, here's another stunning view of the Pool of Bethesda area. Then our group took a moment while seeing the inside of St. Anne's Church, and we sang a couple of worship songs. That was a wonderful experience. Somebody did record it, but I didn't. I didn't bring that here. The acoustics of that place just blew me away, and so I was thankful to get to experience that. And then after that, we would then go to the Garden Tomb. The Garden Tomb was in an exhibit-type place. On the inside of the Garden Tomb, we would hear about different things. We would get to see the Skull Hill. Remember that Jesus was crucified on Golgotha, the place of the skull. So it could be very likely that the top of this mount would have been where he was crucified. The guide was very good about saying, it very well could have been this, but you decide. You make it up in your own mind. And I was very appreciative of that, because I'm like, you're right. It's one of those things where it very well could have happened here. Like 90% sure that it could have happened here, but you decide. And so that was neat. You'll see here, we would get to see the inside of the tomb, and you'll see the opening of that tomb was a bit smaller than my height. It was carved into the side of the hill here. It was not necessarily made for tall people. Joke's on me. Now, while no one knows which tomb Jesus was buried in, you'll hear people joke around saying that he didn't write anything on the walls telling us, I was buried here. It was a sight to see just what a tomb would consist of. The area where they would have laid the body and prepared the body with the things that they did. There would be a waiting area in the tomb for those who would be the ones to prepare. And one of the neat things about this is the door to the tomb, the entrance into the tomb. And I didn't get a photo of it, of the stone that would have been rolled in front of it, but there would be this channel that ran right along the side of this cliff here, and a large round stone would have been rolled through to cover and uncover this tomb, and it would have been kept in place by this channel that was chiseled into the side of the cliff. And by the way, this tomb was very close to what we just saw, Skull Hill. It was mere 100, 200 meters away from it. So again, you decide. Then we would venture after that to St. Peter of Gallicantu Church, which inside there were these prison cells that were carved out of the bedrock below the church. It was quite a sobering sight to and really put into perspective where Jesus might have spent the night before he was crucified. Per Jewish tradition, it has become known as Christ's prison. And this would be a picture from the prison. Looking up, we would get to go down here and view them, and you can see that peephole at the top there. That would have, it was built over with something, but the prisoners would be lowered and raised, from what I've understood, through that hole. They would be lowered and raised by a rope, and there would be another peephole where the guards would be stationed as they were told to watch over these prisoners. Then we would travel over a suspension bridge between the Ben Hinnom Gorge and Mount Zion. And the valley between is known as the Valley of Hinnom. It is also known as Gehenna. Jumping back to the bridge, I was never so thankful to be back on land again. This was a long bridge. It was a suspension bridge, so it was held up by cables. Yes, Brother Cherry. we would get to walk in, and there'd be 35 of us walking, and we'd all be waddling, step with step. And once you all waddle the same way, the bridge just kind of keeps going and going. And I'm like, whoa, stop! And it happened quite a few times, and people were laughing at me because I am not a proponent of heights. You get me 2 feet off the ground, and that's good enough for me. Just ask my father-in-law. Needless to say, the bridge got the rocket pretty good a couple of times. And that was pretty much for day 5. We came back to the hotel. We had a relaxing evening, and it was good to have a low-key evening after all the things that we had experienced up to that time. So here we are at day 6. After that unforgettable day, we ventured here, and we started out in this valley, and this valley is known as the Valley of Elah. This is the valley where David would have defeated Goliath. One of the many memorable moments, and it was moments like this and a host of others that I've shared and will share that brought those biblical stories, those biblical accounts to life. You put yourself in the moment, just like this one. Seeing the sun that would rise between the 2 hills there, Azekah and Soko, really took me there to that moment. And here's another angle of that valley, seeing the hillsides on both sides. We were able to collect some stones from that area, and I thought that was pretty cool as well. We were able to bring those home with us. And then we would begin our adventure to 4 different locations. Now each of these locations were severely impacted by the attacks from Hamas and Hezbollah on October 7th, 2023. It was a day that really shook the country of Israel. We would learn from our first location, Netiv Hasara, of the victims of the attacks at this place. You'll see the pictures of the people, and it was a memorial there, and we would hear stories of what just took place. The woman that was sharing her experience, she had heard the bomb, the missile alarms many times. It was one of those things where it was almost like the boy who cried wolf, except it wasn't, right? She would hear these alarms, and this one morning at 6:20 or 6:30 in the morning, she would hear these alarms, and she would ignore it. But then she would start to hear gunfire outside and think, okay, this is serious. And she would lock herself in there. Each of the homes there would have a bomb shelter. So she would lock herself in her home, and her kids weren't with her at that time. Her kids were with somebody else. So you can imagine as a parent going through that. It's just, when she shared that it had become so normal that nobody moved or nobody, braced for impact or anything like that. They just went about their lives, that they would hear these sirens all the time, or these alarms all the time. We would then go outside and walk down this road to see these shelters dispersed throughout the area. These were hideout shelters, if you will, for when those alarms would sound. This location here was, I believe they said it was about 750 feet away from the Gaza border. We would see that here in just a few moments. We looked over the Gaza area, took a wide pan picture here where those attacks would come from. We would hear explosions off in the distance, followed by some light shock waves a couple seconds later. And there was active things happening during that time. I took this photo because it tells sort of the story of what happened. These terrorists were very strategic in their attacks. They would first take out the security cameras, and so anybody that was watching the security cameras had no way of knowing, because there was no backup, if you will, during that time, or something along those lines. Screens would go black, and these terrorists would fly over the walls with paragliders to these areas, and the attacks would ensue. After visiting there, we would then make our way to 2 kibbutzim, they are called, both of which were attacked, and here you can see some ruins from those attacks. This kibbutz was another area that was close to the Gaza border. We could see, the border from where we were at. We were walking very close to it. Then we would make our way to the final kibbutz, Kibbutz Re'im, and we would hear from one who was a part of the efforts to defend the area during that terrible morning. And last but not least, we traveled to the area which is known as the Nova Festival site. This open-air music festival that was attacked on that morning. This festival had been going through the night. It started the evening before, and so it was going through the night, and the attack happened very early that next morning. And here we would see the memorials of those people who tragically lost their lives on that day. Then the evening came. We took a much-needed break. And that evening we headed out on the town. And yes, we were riding in style for sure. It was funny because one of the gentlemen that was with us and said, this is a 15-passenger van. And the driver looked back at him and said, nope, this is a 12-passenger van. It's like, no, it's 15. No, it's 12. Because you have to have different licensing for a 12-passenger and a 15-passenger. And we're like, okay. Anyways, so just a fun fact. These were a couple of the guys that were with me. That Steven there, he's right behind me. We became pretty good friends on that trip. So we made our way to the market. Food was being sold on the left and the right. There would be some places that would sell fruits, other places that would sell these different types of nuts. We all grabbed a bag of cashews while we were out there, which were delicious. There were other places that were much more lively. I took one of those time-lapse videos as I walked through one of the areas, and for one reason or another, I couldn't find it. I don't know if I deleted it on accident or what, but it was really cool to walk through, and you're just like crowded with everybody else, so you're holding your pockets and things like that, because you just never know, and you want to make sure you have everything in your pockets, and so you're holding on to your things and whatnot, and it was neat to be there. And that ended our day 6, and then we moved on to our next day. And at the start of day 7, we would hear from Colonel Danny Terza, who was the person who planned and implemented Israel's security fence. It was interesting to hear about that. He would share how that same design is now used in many, many other places. And then we made what seemed to be a very long journey down this steep hill to this picture right here. That was a very steep hill, and there were cars coming up that hill at a very fast speed. It was a one-way road, and somebody was going the wrong way, and the other people didn't like it. So there were some other things that ensued on that road as well. We were all safe, but people just aren't happy when you do the wrong thing, right? If it's a one-way, why would you go the wrong way? And they let them have it. But anyways, so we would walk down this hill. It was a steep hill. Our feet were nice and tired by the bottom of that. And we would get to see the Pool of Siloam. It would be within this area called the City of David. Here's kind of a wide view of that area. Up until the year 2022, this actually portion of it wasn't here. This excavation was not happening. What was seen was a small pool. And then these major excavations took place, revealing more of the Pool of Siloam, where Jesus sent the blind man to wash and be healed. We would get to take a special limited access tour on the path that would be known as the Pilgrim's Road, the road to the temple, and this was not open to the public at that time. We would be walking along, and every once in a while the guide that was with us would show us these holes, and below this path was the path that everybody else got to take while we were on this limited access one that they were still kind of excavating and things like that. And you'll see this picture here, just how there's different structures there because it's under houses, it's under buildings and such. And the area, this picture here, this was actually all a parking lot at one time. And from what I remember, they were removing part of the parking lot and they came across this area by accident. And once you come across something, guess what you can't do anymore? You got to contact somebody. You got to contact different areas, and needless to say, this is where it's at now. And they were actively excavating different areas of that part while we were sitting there watching them. One moment. I'm losing signal up here. Oh, there we go. Okay, here's another view of that road. I was toward the back of my group, so I just turned around and took a picture going the other way because I was the slow one in the group, I guess. Again, it was underneath some houses and different things like that, so it had to be built up, the structure did. And we would then get to travel through more of these underground tunnels, and we would finally make our way to the temple. Here's a photo of that. You'll see the different layers of rocks because much of it was rebuilt sometime during the Byzantine era. If I heard the guide correctly, there were piles of rocks that were in front of it that would have been, there when it had been when the destruction had happened. Another picture of that. You'll see kind of the road there and the different piles of rocks there. We make our way to the southern side of the temple, and I thought for perspective that I would take a photo of some of the foundational stones from the temple. I'm just over 6 feet tall, and these foundation stones towered over me, and they were large. You can imagine, trying to move some of those as well. And then we would turn around to see the southern steps. Now, some theologians, scholars believe that Peter preached on the day of Pentecost in this very area. It was a large area. It was an area that could hold many people. There are some other biblical scriptures that they've used to somewhat support this as well, but the Bible does not explicitly state that. Let me just say that. But it was an interesting thing to ponder on anyway. Just noticing the area, and you'll notice here to the right here, there were actually areas where there were these pools for washing. So if you think about that, maybe there were some baptisms that would have taken place right there at that time as well. Just some interesting things to think about in that regard. And here's another view from those steps looking up. Again, to the right there, you'll see where those pools would have been, and below that. And then we ended our day again at the western wall. I didn't take a photo of the wall, but I looked behind me to see the sun just kind of escaping behind the buildings, and I thought I would share a photo of that. I couldn't miss the wonderful photo opportunity. And then we made our way to Tiberias at the end of that day, and we would stay at the Magdala Hotel. The body of water you see out there is the Sea of Galilee. Now, this is something, and not that I wasn't looking forward to anything else, because I was looking forward to the whole trip, but I was really looking forward to seeing the Sea of Galilee. I have these photos a little out of order, but this picture. I walked out of my hotel room, which we were at the Magdala Hotel, and I walked out and I looked back and I just saw the sun rising, and it was one of those moments that you didn't want to miss. You want to keep with you forever. So starting day 8 then, before we went to the Sea of Galilee, we would take a quick tour of the ancient Jewish city of Magdala. So this was right outside of the Magdala Hotel, all of these ruins and these different areas, and it's said to be one of the oldest synagogues in Israel. Included in the ruins would be a marketplace and a place for the fishermen to go. Some scholars suggest that Jesus visited and taught within these walls. Mary Magdalene is said to have been here. She would travel with Jesus as one of his followers and as a witness of his crucifixion. Jesus visited Mary. Mary would have been the first to see the resurrected Jesus. We then ventured onward to the town of Capernaum, where we would see more ruins of an ancient synagogue. It would also be a place where fishermen would go with their catches. Here's some pictures of that. You see the different areas. There was also within this area some really heavy round stones that they would use for pressing olives to make olive oil and whatnot. I had some pictures, but I neglected to add them too. So if you want to see them, I'll show you after service or after my presentation tonight. Now there was a synagogue that was built virtually on top of some of Capernaum, that of which was built in like the 4th or 5th century, and this was just a picture of one of those columns from that synagogue that was built on top of that. And then finally, the Sea of Galilee. So here's kind of a video of that. Oh, maybe. I don't know how to do that. Can you hit play from back there? I thought I could do it from here. Well, anyways, it's all right. This was just a picture of it. It was a video of just kind of panning the whole area. And then we traveled on a boat across the Sea of Galilee. As we traveled across, I was overcome by everything that took place on or around these waters. As I've shared with some, I didn't have a dry eye the entire time I was on the sea. I was just overwhelmed with everything. And here's another picture of the sea and a picture of the boat that we were on. And then after the trip across, it was time for a quick lunch. Lunches would vary. Sometimes we would eat shawarma, other times schnitzel, sometimes we'd eat falafel, and sometimes Doritos. Fun fact about this, you can't find this flavor in the States. I think you might be able to order it on Amazon, but other than that, it's not here. Anybody want to know what that flavor is? You see the well, you're close. So the little verbiage on the front translates as lots of spicy. And I did look it up, and it can also be read as spicy sour, but it really wasn't spicy. Okay, and maybe they talked about different spices. Maybe they weren't talking about heat spice. It was full of flavor. It was a delicious chip. I'm just going to put that out there, and we'll move on from that. So now after dinner, we would wind down to the end of day 7. We would visit this beautiful market, learning about the history of the fruit called a date, and its upbringing back into Israel. At one time or another, it was removed from the country, or removed from this area anyway. And once I figured out like this was actually the case, as we were traveling along, there were a lot of date trees all over this area, and I thought there was some other kind of fruit, but they were in fact date trees. Later that evening, a few of us from the group went for a walk around and through the church there that was by the Magdala Hotel. I won't try to announce that because I don't want to butcher that, but it was a church there right beside it. We were told that there was a great photo opportunity outside. The priest that was there, he's like, "Hey, come here, I want you to take a photo of this." And we're like, "Okay," so we follow him outside, and it's dark outside, and we were actually on the inside of this sanctuary here, and all of the apostles are on each of those columns, even Judas, but all the apostles but Judas had a little what do you want to call it? Halo, thank you. A halo around them besides Judas. And so that was interesting to see. And there was a boat here, and he said, you just wait till we go outside. We're like, okay, we'll go outside. And I took a picture of this. And he's like, now you need to share it on Instagram. And I'm like, we'll see. So make sure to tag me in it. Okay. So anyways, so we did that, and that was the end of our day 8. And then we finally got to the final day of the trip. I say finally, but it was a bittersweet moment, in fact. We started off with a tour of the Golan Heights, taking a Jeep tour with Elon Schulman. We did. Our driver was also named Elon, and yes, we did joke around with him a little bit about Elon and whatnot. He's like, no, nothing like that. We're like, we're just having a good time. So. We would see different areas, including this building, which was ransacked by the Syrians. At one time, it was bombed by them. It was a place where, where Israel would have their offices and whatnot for the defense forces. Afterwards, we would stop for our final lunch of the trip, and I chose something quite colorful for lunch that day. Many of the items you see, like the purple thing in the middle, and the carrots, and the peppers, and even the salad on the bottom, was all pickled. It was all pickled in some way. So a lot of pickled food for lunch that day. It probably wasn't the best choice, but at least I had some falafel in the corner. You can't forget about the falafel. I did try a lot of different things on that trip. One of the days for lunch while we were in the Jewish quarter, we found a hamburger place. I raised my eyebrow too, Joe. I'm like, okay, let's see what this hamburger place is about. So for $20, you'd get this half-pound hamburger and like a large fry. It was delicious, actually. It was very, very good. And I believe that was also during like the time of Shabbat. So this restaurant was obviously not recognizing Shabbat. There were some that didn't, some people that didn't. So, you find those places, and I guess you eat there too, because we would go across the street and like, hey, can we get shawarma here, schnitzel? Can we get falafel? And they're like, no. Sorry. And they said, yeah, we can't do that. Okay, and so we would go to that hamburger place, and again, the hamburgers were delicious, and they actually made mention of like, Omaha steaks. And things like that, and so that was cool. Another interesting thing, when we were visiting those kibbutzim, the areas that were attacked, the kibbutzim and the netivs were basically, this might not be a very good term to use, but they were basically seen as like loose communes. Everybody took care of everybody. They especially in the kibbutzim, they would all take care of each other's needs. They would all work together. There was one that we went to that actually had a dairy farm within it. And I know not a whole lot about dairy cattle, but I know that they are a very synchronized animal. They run off a very rigid schedule, and so if they get off schedule, then bad things can happen, right? I don't know, again, all the ins and outs. So I asked the guy, I'm like, so what happened to the dairy farm while the attacks were happening? And there were actually people that chose to stick around just to take care of the dairy farm in the midst of the attacks that were happening, because they can also be affected by that stuff too. If anything startles them or gets them off kilter a little bit, they would do their best to keep the animals, safe, if you will. Now, going back to our day 9, I'm sorry, that was a little side note. We ended our tour in Caesarea, seeing structures like these and many, many more. And then, of course, the view of the Mediterranean Sea. As the sun would begin to set, another captivating moment. It would be one of those moments that was bittersweet. There were a few moments during the trip that I did find myself getting homesick, but I would look forward to soon being home again. And this was a video, but for one reason or another, they're not playing, and that's... Oh, it is playing. Oh, it is playing for you all. Okay, great. Was the last one playing too? Oh, good. Praise the Lord. Yeah, so that was that. Here, we'll just do that again. Is it going to go? Okay, well. Yeah. I'm glad that's working. Okay, and then finally we would make our 11-and-a-half-hour flight home. Back to the United States. And with that, I want to thank you for joining me tonight. I really hope that you enjoyed these pictures and videos of my trip. I did want to open up, I may not be able to answer all your questions, but does anybody have any questions about my trip that they'd like to ask? I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. Josh. We did not get an opportunity to have many conversations with the guided tour. There was not a whole lot of time allotted for that. However, our tour guide in Israel, there's no one like that guy. I can say that because, I guess it was my first time there, but hearing from others who had been there 30 to 40 times, they said they'd never had a tour guide like that guy. So he was a very, and the experiences that we did have, Israel at one point in time was busting at the seams with tourism. And since these attacks had happened, tourism had been way, way down. So they were very welcoming. They were like, hey, welcome to Israel, and we would buy different things and, barter and different things like that, which, by the way, that's a cool experience too. When they're selling something for $350 and you can get it for $50, it did happen. I had a gentleman in my group, he saw this nice wood structure that he really liked, and they were selling it for $250. He's like, watch this. And I'm like, okay. I think he got him down to like $40. But that being said, that's just how it is. That the United States is one of the only cultures that does not do that. Anyways, but good question. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so from what I've understood, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Warsaw, so there recently, and I don't know how recent it was, but Poland was attacked, and what was built there before was some bigger building. I'm not very familiar with what happened, but there was an attack that happened more recently to a larger building that was there, and there were ruins all around from that they were trying to rebuild, and this was actually built there as a memorial of that. So Yes, Sister Shirley. So the question was, did most of the people speak English on my trip, like that were with me, or? Yeah, so some spoke more English than others. When we would visit certain restaurants in Israel, there were some restaurants that the translator or the tour guide had to be there because he could speak like 7 different languages. Hashtag goals, right? So he would translate for us, and he just made the trip very enjoyable because he took all the stress away, as a good tour guide should, I'm sure. So yes, there were some places where they did not speak any English, and one of the places that we went that I had schnitzel, the lady that was preparing my food, she said, "Say this," and I'm like, "What?" And the tour guide was telling me that she was saying to say this, and so I tried to repeat it, and she's like, "Nope." So just different fun things like that. So it definitely. But in Poland, I don't remember having. Yeah, they did speak English in Poland. So where we were at in Poland, anyway. So yeah. Sisters, pal. Oh my, I could talk for 2 more hours on that. I really, the trip as a whole was impactful in that it opened my eyes to, on the Israel side of things, again, just seeing these areas that you read about in Scripture, you read about in these different biblical accounts, and getting to be there, walking where potentially Jesus would have walked, and I'll say too, so that was one, but being in Poland, you felt the things that were happening in those areas. You know what I mean? You had this feeling of like, just low, this low feeling come over you. These depressive things come over you. These thoughts of, it's only a matter of time type thing. You can't really put yourself in their shoes, but you can just feel the atmosphere. And you can't help but think that everybody else was feeling that as well. There would be times where I would be walking through the death camps, and certain smells would come to me, and they weren't pleasant. It was one of those things, and I'm like, "Boy, what is that?" So you were really just like in the moment there. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Any other questions, Brother Cherry? Oh, I'll come to you next. Yes. All the time. All the time. One of the more captivating moments for me was definitely the Sea of Galilee. It's in everything that happened on and around that, and even Caesarea too. By Caesarea I was really tired, so I was looking forward to being home. So I wasn't able to focus a whole lot during that time. I was packed up, and my mind was already 3,000 miles away from there. But being in these places, these places where we read about in the biblical accounts, it just brought those things to life. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, and you better believe that as the waves were crashing, I was sitting for part of it, and the waves would crash and hit me in the face, and I'm just like, oh Lord, your mind goes to Him being the one who calms the storms and different things like that, and there were these times of worship that we would all just be worshiping the Lord while we were on this boat. It was just some boat, but getting to experience that and say, wow, Lord, thank you for bringing this to life for me. Pardon? I didn't quite hear your question. Was I protected from getting sick? Yeah, I mean, so there was only one time that I ate something that was probably a little questionable. But other than that, I felt fine. There were a few other gentlemen in the group that had eaten the same thing that were having similar problems. I won't go into detail on that. But yeah, everyone was pretty healthy the whole time. There were some people who got pretty dehydrated on the trip, so they would have to go to the hospital, but they did tell us to start drinking gallons of water before the trip started so that we would not get dehydrated. Some heeded that and others did not. So, any other questions? Yes. 100%. But the question was, would I do this again? Yes. Over and over. Yes. My only, and while I was very thankful to be home, and I did not want to be away from home any longer, if the trip was longer, I would have been okay with that. You know, we did so many things, and like I said, this was jam-packed. You saw just some photos of the trip and whatnot, but we did so many things every single day that, you know, you literally had to either take a moment that evening and or sleep on it or wake up early and go through your notes. I've got, you know, about 60 different journal entries that I did on my phone, and I wrote some things down and things like that, just because I wanted to remember it all. You could definitely take a 2 to 3 week trip in each of those areas and still not go through it all. So yes, if there's another opportunity, sign me up. But you know, a few years down the road, I'm good for a couple years. So thank you for asking that. Any other questions? Yes, sir. What kind of food did they eat when it was not the Shabbat? Yeah, so during Shabbat, there was no, the hotel that we were at, there was a little bit of both food that was cooked and food that was not. So I'm not sure how that all worked out there. Maybe some people did this and others didn't. But when it was not Shabbat, they would eat fish and they'd be able to cook all this food. During the Shabbat dinner, all the food was prepared beforehand, and there were plates and plates and plates. There was, 6 different courses of food that they brought out. Just when you thought you were done, here comes another course of food, right? And they would prepare different things. I don't remember what all they were. There were weird things that stuck out to me, like liver paste and whatnot, which I actually really enjoyed. I wish they would have that kind of thing here. Everybody's putting their nose up, and I understand it, but it was good. They would bring out this chicken cordon bleu, but without the ham, because we were in Israel and pigs are frowned upon there. The interesting thing about that too, which we heard a story. Now that you've got me thinking about it. The only way that a person could eat a pig or a piece of meat from a pig is if they raised that pig on anything but land. So if you built like a cement slab and you raised the pig on that cement slab, you could eat a portion of that pig because it wasn't touching the land. But you could only eat the bacon from it. Anyways, fun fact. Next question? Chris? So when we were at the Western Wall, there were people worshiping. There's speculation there of the Jews and what they believe and whatnot, but they were dancing. They had different instruments that they were playing, and they were shouting and while they were praying. So I think if that's kind of what you're referring to, so outside of Shabbat, yes, being there in the midst of all that, you were very caught up in that moment because there was an atmosphere of worship there, and you could, how sometimes you can really feel like the presence of God in certain places based on what other people are doing, and if you don't, then anyways. But so that was definitely one time, well, two times that you felt a very hearty presence of God, if that answers your question. But other than that, I don't think there was anything else that I experienced as far as the Jewish customs that stuck out to me, I guess. We on these tours, when we weren't in like the Jewish quarter or we weren't at the Western Wall, we were on a bus and we were touring these different areas, which was good and bad at the same time. It was cool to be able to take those moments outside of the guided tour, which they said, yeah, you can do this, but we're not in charge of you at this time. Okay, cool, thanks. But we would go to the Jewish quarter. We would go to the other quarters of the city, and we would see these markets, these thriving markets. As far as being there, that was an interesting part of that as well. So, Sister Shirley, did you have another question, or did you ask? You haven't asked one yet. I will say that it cost me a fraction of what the trip should have cost. The trip was heavily subsidized, and I had to pay for a mere fraction of that, and then I had to pay for my flight there. So I was very blessed to be able to go for the price that I went for. Yes. Any other? Yes, Brother Josh. Okay. Okay. So the question was, if I can summarize it, there were certain Christian things that we believe, according to the Bible, that have happened, these biblical accounts, but then there's Jewish customs. Now, this is one thing that our guide was very, very good about, and something that I appreciate. He's like, oh, this was Jewish custom. Well, this was actually what happened in the Bible. I'm like, really? Wow. You don't hear that a whole lot. This guy was like well-versed in the Bible. He was well-versed in his history and things like that, so he was able to discern between those two. I off the top of my head, I can't think of anything that he talked about that was like that, but he would say, oh, that was according to Jewish history. This is biblical history, and so on. And he would say these things, and you're like, wow, I really appreciate that. Does that answer your question? So we were given a good dose of both, but he would make sure that he separated the two so as to not intermingle them, because that's also a very thing that they don't like to do as well. So thank you. Next, any other questions? Yes. Well, there's a number. So the question was, how differently do they dress compared to how we dress? Not much. There's the different groups of Jews definitely dress up more during their time at like the Western Wall and during certain celebrations and whatnot, but essentially they dress the same. So I didn't feel out of place there, but by any means. Again, they were very welcoming. We would eat at these restaurants, and these guys would be like over the top excited for us to be there. And I'm like, this is great. I could eat at this place all the time. I would pay whatever I needed to eat here. We would, there would be some grumpiness, but where isn't there that, right? Thank you. Any other questions? Brother Connor. Yeah, so, sorry, go ahead. Yes. So the question was the path that we were walking seemed to be like underground. The Pilgrim's Road from the Pool of Siloam to the temple, I think is what you're referring to, and even some of the other, I'll call them catacombs that we walked through. The area at that time had been a parking lot, and so all of that area was covered by asphalt or some kind of cement or whatever, different things like that. And they were removing it for one reason or another, and they came across these areas, so they began removing more of it. And where we were walking through was going under like a road. It was going under some certain housing structures, and the people that were doing these excavations, I guess the company or whatever you want to call them, there were houses above them that the people couldn't live in any longer because it wasn't safe for them to live in the houses with there being no dirt underneath them or foundation. So they would buy these houses that way that the people would be safe. And some people chose to move, and other people wouldn't. They wouldn't like force them, but there would be the opportunity there. Does that answer your question? So it was built over upon. There were a lot of places, like even the temple was rebuilt in a certain way with different structures. You'd see the different types of stones that would be used after a destruction, and with this being underground, that would have been like the original height, I guess, of the land at that time. But they keep building up because they can't build out, so they build up. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, well, again, thank you all for joining me tonight. I really appreciate you all being here, and God bless you.